Hello, members, and hello to you, Robert Cox. Namaste. Welcome all to the first class of the first course of the School of Sacred Mysteries Master Program in Alchemy at the End of Time. I am your host, Deborah Bell Foreman. Well, we are finally here at the threshold of our program, about to embark together on a truly great adventure in learning. Before we start, I did want to mark this beginning with a moment of conscious awareness as we set out, and with an expression of gratitude for the opportunity to learn esoteric philosophy and metaphysics, not from an academic teacher who is describing it, analyzing it, categorizing it, and trying to understand it from the outside in, but from a disciplined and dedicated practitioner whose meditative life and its fruits has allowed him to marry erudition with direct intuitive cognition, productive of remarkable insights and a genuine synthesis of consciousness and physics. One more point. I know that there are many impatient readers out there who, like myself, will skip over a preface and an introduction to jump into the text proper. The first time I read Pillar, that is what I did. When I went back on the second go-around and read both the preface and introduction, I was amazed at how juicy they are, and I want to urge you not to miss them. I will quote one passage before handing over the ball to Robert. This book has not been written as a dry academic exercise. It has been written with passion and fervor by one who is himself on a journey of perpetual self-discovery. Furthermore, it is presented with practical aim in mind. Its purpose is to uncover the spiritual, philosophical, historical, and scientific background of an extremely important body of knowledge. This knowledge pertains to a sacred alchemical science that once was shared by ancient seers around our planet. I hold that the essence of this sacred science was lost several thousand years ago, and now is being rediscovered and reconstructed by researchers around the world. If you stay with these classes through a full year, you will be among the first people to be exposed to and to understand some of the deepest secrets that have been kept for millennia by the privileged members of the underground stream about the relationship of matter and consciousness, and will look back at this beginning with a sense of accomplishment and great satisfaction. Robert, would you like to begin with your invocations?
Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, I was thinking to start the course with an invocation, which is really a recitation of what was considered the first piece of knowledge in the Vedic tradition, which corresponds to the first verse of the Rig Veda. In the Vedic tradition, it was generally held that the first expression of a body of knowledge contains the entire truth, the entire knowledge that's further elaborated in any given text. And all the Vedic texts were written that way. And the Rig Veda is considered the oldest and most authoritative of the Vedic texts. No one really knows how old it is because it was passed down for thousands of years as an oral text before it was ever written down. But it's known to be at least 3,500 years old, possibly as much as 6,000 years old. And its first verse is really an identification with Agni, which is considered the messenger between gods and men. And it says, Agnim mile purohitam yagyasya devam ritvajam hotaram ratnadatamam. I won't bother with a translation of this because this is actually a mantra, a formula, a sonic formula in which the numbers of words, syllables, and letters are all pregnant with meaning, as well as their sequence. One of the things about the Rig Veda that most modern scholars do not recognize is that it encodes many hidden levels of meaning that are not available on the basis of grammatical analysis using Sanskrit grammar. In fact, the Rig Veda itself states this. It says there are at least 3 hidden levels of meaning in every measured form of speech in the Rig Veda. And they were all considered measured forms of speech because they were all composed in terms of Vedic meters, which restrict the expressions to a certain number of syllables, and so on. But it says there are at least 3 hidden levels of meaning, which were known to the wise Brahmins alone, the knowers of Brahman, and which cannot be determined by grammatical analysis. They're said to be na ingayanti, which means not analyzable by grammar. And they were determined by the sequence of the letters, numbers, and the sequence and number of letters, syllables, and words out of which the mantras were formulated. But I want to also begin with basically an analysis of the first verse of the Rig Veda would take up an entire book. If I were to write a book about it, it would take an entire book to explain it. In fact, much of that is described in my book, Creating the Soul Body, where I show that the letters in the Rig Veda literally map out the sequence of layers of consciousness that constitute the path of immortality. But I wanted, since we're really starting a course on alchemy here, I want to also make another comment, and that is that the Rig Veda is the oldest text known in history that talks about an elixir capable of giving enlightenment and spiritual immortality called soma, or the rasa. And you've probably heard of soma before, and most people think it comes from a plant substance and so on, juices of a plant. But there's a deeper interpretation of this. And in fact, the cognate word rasa not only means blood, it also means mercury, metallic liquid mercury, and which was considered one of the principal ingredients out of which the philosophical elixir, the elixir of immortality, was made by alchemical traditions around the world. And so the Rig Veda can be viewed as really, in fact, there's an entire mandala or book. The 9th mandala of Rig Veda is almost devoted exclusively to the soma, or the rasa, and the means by which it was produced and consumed for the sake of realizing the gods, realizing higher states of consciousness, and attaining spiritual immortality. So really, the Rig Veda is the first alchemical text that we have in the history of the world. In this regard, in the Western tradition, the oldest and most authoritative of the alchemical texts in the Hermetic tradition was considered the Emerald Tablet, or the Smaragdina, the Tabula Smaragdina in Latin. And it starts also with a very important passage, which states, and I'm quoting, "That which is below corresponds to that which is above, and that which is above corresponds to that which is below, in the accomplishment of the miracle of one thing." And that one thing, as a side comment, is the act of creation. And then it goes on to say, "It is the father of every completed thing in the whole world." It meaning the correspondence between that which is above and that which is below is the father of every completed thing in the whole world. Now I want to compare this passage, which is considered the oldest and most authoritative of the Hermetic texts, with another passage taken from the Rig Veda, written some thousands of years prior, thousands of miles away, which is considered the oldest and most authoritative of the Vedic texts. The passage from the Rig Veda, in translation, and I'm quoting, "He who knows the father of this world as that which is below associated with that which is above, and that which is above associated with that which is below, he, as it were, has the mind of a sage." I find a remarkable correspondence between these two passages, both of which identify the father of this world as that which is above associated with that which is below, and vice versa. And this, my friends, is the key to understanding in its true depth the relationship between consciousness and matter, which is the essence of the science of alchemy. And there's much more to this than meets the eye. And the concept of above and below um, is really the relationship between heaven and earth. It's the relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm. It's the relationship between that aspect of the Supreme Self, which is bigger than the biggest, and that aspect of the Supreme Self, which is smaller than the smallest. And these can be compared to infinity and point in its most absolute form. And in the Vedic tradition, these were called Atman, the infinite self, and Jiva, the point self. And these were considered to be identified with one another, such that the Atman, which represents the field, the unbounded field of pure consciousness, adopts a point of view in order to know itself. And that point of view was called the Jiva, the individual self or the individual soul. But when the unbounded field of pure consciousness adopts a point of view to know its own unboundedness, it becomes an individual self while remaining a universal and infinite self. And that individual self was called the Kshetragya, which literally means the knower of the field. Kshetra means field, and Gya means knower. So the point value of consciousness was the knower of the field. It was the knower of the self, the infinite self. And it knew the infinite self as its own self. And so you have a self-referral relationship between infinity and point, which is the relationship between the unbounded infinite self and the point-like self, both of which are described as aspects of the same supreme reality, which is both bigger than the biggest, Mahato Mahiyan, and smaller than the smallest, Anor Aniyan in Sanskrit. That is the starting point from which everything else is created. It is the father of every completed thing in the whole world. It is that which is above, which is infinite, and that which is below, which is infinitesimal, associated with one another in mutual correspondence, in mutual identification, which gives rise to everything that exists in between point and infinity, in between the infinitesimal and the infinite, which consist of the entire creation. The mechanics of that are elaborate and detailed, and I won't go into it at this stage in our discussion. But the point is that what the Vedic seers and the Hermetic sages were talking about in these opening passages to these important passages in their most authoritative texts, was a fundamental principle that everything that exists in creation is created as a balance between that which is above and that which is below. It's a balance between the macroscopic realm of heaven and the microscopic realms of earth. And we as human beings are born symbolically in the middle of the relationship between point and infinity. We're born with our feet planted on the earth and our heads soaring in the sky, in the heavens. We're the link between heaven and earth. We're the link. Our consciousness, human consciousness, is the link between the infinite and the infinitesimal. It's the balance point. We are the balance point between that which is above and that which is below. And we reflect that relationship in our bodies, our minds, and in our consciousness. And as a result, as the Bible tells us, we are created in the image of God. We're created in the image of the Father. Because we embody that balance, correspondence between that which is above and that which is below. And being created in the image of the Father, we have the potential to function as co-creators on earth. Co-creators with the Creator. And that gives human beings the ability to engineer nature, to fulfill our desires and intentions. And that's why we have the ability to dominate nature in the sense of being able to control the forces of nature through scientific methodologies, using material technologies. You know, we can control the electromagnetic force through electromagnetic devices. We can control the electric force through all kinds of electric technologies, and basically engineer nature to fulfill our purposes. But there's another approach to engineering nature which modern science doesn't yet recognize. And that is the use of mental technologies to engineer nature. By mental technologies, I mean literally mental techniques to engineer nature. To cause the rains to come on time, to cause the seasons to operate properly, to cause the flora and fauna of the earth to flourish, and to cause human society to function as a coherent, harmonious whole. These techniques were known in ancient times. They were practiced both individually through various mental techniques of meditation and so on. They were also practiced collectively in the form of large sacred rituals that were organized by the sages and seers of these ancient civilizations, the first civilizations on Earth. Of course, much of that has been lost over time. The science of it was lost over time because it is science. It is a scientific process which allows consciousness to influence matter, to influence not only matter, but the forces that govern matter as well. Force and matter, governed by consciousness. Just as we can govern force and matter using material technologies, the ancients knew how to engineer nature using mental technologies. It's the old mind-body dichotomy, which is not really a dichotomy at all, because we experience nature within our mind. And the source of both the mental impressions that are created in our mind from our sensory experience and the objects of the world as they exist in reality outside of our mind are both supported by the same underlying field of pure consciousness, which is really the subjective essence of God, the Creator, the Father of the whole world. So one of the aspects that we have in engineering nature, one of the practical aspects of this ancient science was alchemy. And alchemy is all about the relationship between consciousness and matter. It was all about, and it is all about, waking up the conscious nature within matter. It was all about removing the veil of ignorance, the veil of tamas, which is a Sanskrit word. One of the three fundamental qualities of nature is called tamas, translated directly as inertia. The modern scientific word for it is mass. Removing the veil of tamas from matter allows consciousness to shine through. It also removes the veil of mass from matter. And that's why those who consumed the elixir or who produced it naturally within their bodies, according to the ancients, the elixir can be produced naturally. The human body is a natural alchemical vessel in which transmutations can take place through the agency of consciousness. And we have the ability of an enlightened person, an enlightened human being, has the ability through the fire of tapas, which is a Sanskrit word that means heating, and was applied to any spiritual practice, which is considered performing tapas, spiritual heating. Through the performance of tapas, through the spiritual practice conducted by the mind within the vessel of the human body, we have the ability to produce the elixir within our own bodies. And that elixir flows through the veins in the blood veins in our body as rasa, a Sanskrit word that both means the elixir and blood. That's why the first original Vedic seers from which the tradition has descended, the forefather of all those seers was known as Angiras, and his chief son was known as Agni, to whom the first verse of the Rig Veda is dedicated. And his descendants or followers were known as the Angirasas, after the patriarch of the line. And the word Angiras is a Sanskrit word which may seem unfamiliar, but it's known in etymological circles, in linguistics, that the word Angiras became Angiros in Old Persian, became Angelos in Old Greek, and became Angelos in Latin, and became angel in English, and messenger between gods and men. And the derivation of that word in Sanskrit comes from Angir, which means limb, and rasa, the elixir of immortality. The Angirasas, the followers or descendants of Angiras, who played the same role in the Indian subcontinent that the Shimsu Hor, the followers of Horus, played in Egypt. The Angirasas were those who had the elixir of immortality flowing through their limbs. They were the embodiments of the sacred science of alchemy, as were the Shimsuhor. There's quite a bit of evidence in that regard as well. So we're talking about something that is very profound, that goes back to the very beginnings of human history on Earth. The shadowy realms of prehistory, before there were written documents, before there were any cities, before there were any villages, before there were any organized forms of religion, before there were any organized forms of government, before there was royalty. When the earth resembled a veritable Garden of Eden, which was inhabited by mysterious Merlins of the forest, great sages who held secret alchemical wisdom and practiced the sacred science of alchemy. Even at that very early epoch, using clay pots and woolen filters made of sheepskins and other very crude pounding stones and other very crude instruments. But and as I demonstrate in my book that's coming out this fall, called The Elixir of Immortality, which will be published in November of this coming year by Inner Traditions, I demonstrate there that all of the materials and the procedures and the equipment needed to make the elixir were available 10,000 years ago. The key thing to understand about this process of alchemy, the means of producing this sacred elixir from matter, mainly from the metals, is that it's like baking a cake. You know, the European alchemists described this as, once you know the ingredients and the procedures, they said it's child's play and woman's work. It's like a woman baking a cake, following a recipe. Very simple. And it's for that reason, well, it's one of the reasons, that their writings of the alchemists were written in code language, to hide their secrets from the unwary. Because if those secrets were ever clearly revealed, what was considered the great work, the magnum opus, would be seen as nothing more than child's play and woman's work. Because it is very simple, it involves low-tech procedures and methodologies that requires nothing more than it could all be done with some clay pots and a wood fire. Of course, today, and even in medieval Europe, the alchemists employed more sophisticated methods. They used furnaces and athanors and glass vessels and so on. But in the earliest periods, none of those things were available and they weren't needed. There are ways of doing it, and extremely simple and very crude, but produces the effect. In this regard, the Angirasas were known as the performers of the 9 or 10 months rite. A ritual in which they would sit around the soma vessel, the vessel that enclosed the ingredients out of which the elixir was made. They would sit around the vessel and meditate and chant for 9 to 10 months while the elixir was being born in the vessel. It's exactly what the European alchemists, the same time frame for the production of the elixir. Once the materials are put into the hermetically sealed vessel, they're supposed to remain in there without the laying on of hands for 9 to 10 months, being subjected to the gentle flame of the fire. And the work in the vessel was said to be conducted by God, just as the work in the female womb, which gives birth to a human child, is conducted by God. Just as the work, of planting a seed in the ground, which produces a plant under the gentle heat of the sun, is the work of God. They considered it a completely natural process, a process in which human beings were playing the role of co-creators. Throughout the world, alchemists believed that the elixir, the final product, the final end result of this process, does not exist naturally on the face of the earth, but that the potential is there in the earth for the production of the elixir, and that all they were doing was using art and science to speed up the evolutionary process of nature so that matter could obtain its apotheosis as the most spiritually developed form of matter that exists in the universe. I'm talking about a type of atom, a type of matter, in which the veil of ignorance, the veil of Tamas, has been removed, so that its inner conscious nature shines through, so that it becomes a source of consciousness, an enlightened atom, if you want to say it, a guru atom, if you want to say it, an atom that is fully awake to the reality of the self. And when those atoms are ingested, taken into the human body, they wake up like a guru that has disciples. These guru atoms go into the body and enlighten the other atoms in the body. And this means that the veil of ignorance in the body itself begins to be removed, and the human being.
Our recording got dropped and we're picking up where we left off. Go ahead, Rob.
So we're talking about how the atoms of the elixir function when they're in the body. And the point is that they do not function as chemicals. They don't interact chemically with the chemical substrates of the body. They're chemically inert. They interact with the other atoms through physics. Really, it scarcely can be called physics. It's more like metaphysics. Because the operation is on the level of mind and consciousness. But essentially, these atoms, when circulating in the body and taking up residence within the cells of the body, enlighten the other atoms and material substrates of the body to the point where the human being begins to realize that the physical material body itself is nothing other than a form of consciousness. The ancients believed that the reality of a thing, which is at the beginning and the end, must pervade all the stages between the beginning and end of that thing. And they held that everything begins in consciousness and ends in consciousness, and in between we have the appearance of a material world, a material body that is actually a crystallized form of consciousness. And by removing the veil of ignorance from the body, from matter, human awareness has the ability to see that reality, to see that the body itself is just a crystallized form of consciousness. And based upon that, cognition of the connection between consciousness and matter, really, the whole science of alchemy comes out of that cognition. The whole science of alchemy comes out of that understanding of the relationship between consciousness and matter, how consciousness assumes the form of matter and how matter can reassume the form of consciousness. Now the key, the link, and this is where we start moving into Pillar of Celestial Fire. The key or link between consciousness and matter is what the ancients called, well, in modern language it would be called life force, subtle energy or subtle matter, because it really transcends the distinction between radiant energy and matter. It's literally mind stuff. In Sanskrit, this is called chitta, which literally means the reflection, ta, of chit, pure consciousness, in the material creation. Chitta is thus different from chit. But chitta, in the Japanese tradition, is called ki. In the Taoist tradition, is called chi. It's the subtle stuff out of which the yin-yang principle was formed. It's the subtle life force that is symbolized by the two serpents wrapped around the central rod of the caduceus of Mercury. The Ida is known in Sanskrit as the Ida and the Pingala, which are the two currents of subtle energy that wind around the spine, going up to the third eye, the spiritual eye, and then blossoming in the brain. The blossoming is compared to 1,000-petaled radiant lotus, which manifests, which is dripping with nectar, the nectar of bliss. But much of the Pillar of Celestial Fire is focused upon this subtle energy, subtle matter, mind stuff, however you want to describe it, which is the link between pure consciousness and matter. And this stuff is not known in physics. Well, I take it back. There is a candidate for this substance in quantum theory. Quantum theory goes through and basically categorizes and classifies all the possible elementary particles that can exist, at least in principle, in nature. And these atoms the elementary particles are classified in terms of their quantum spin, their intrinsic spin angular momentum, which you don't really need to understand what that represents, but you can think of it as like a spinning point, kind of. And all of the known particles that can be observed, such as electrons and protons, photons, and so on, have finite spin states. They're either integers or half integers of a certain quantity. 1 half, 1, 3 halves, 2, so on, times a certain quantity tells you what their spin is. And and particles are classified according to these things. For example, all matter particles are half-integral particles. They have half-integral spin states. All force particles have integral spin states. But all of the known particles that can be observed have finite spin states. Well, quantum theory predicts, and it's required by the principles of the theory, that there exists a unique type of particle that has an infinitesimal spin state. That particle is called a Higgs particle and is said to be the particle that is responsible for the appearance of mass in all the other particles. Now remember that mass is a direct translation of the word tamas, or inertia in Sanskrit. And I make the case in some detail in a book that's yet unpublished called Transcendental Mechanics that the Higgs particles, these infinitesimal spin elementary particles, are actually particles of mind stuff. These particles have never been observed in a quantum experiment and never will. They're believed to form an all-pervading field that pervades all of space, and when regular particles move through this field, they acquire what is called mass or inertia. But no one has ever observed a Higgs particle. They're hypothetical particles which are required to exist in principle, but which cannot be observed in practice by any empirical means. Well, that's exactly the nature of the mind. We all know that the mind exists. We all experience mental states. But you cannot observe a mental state using any form of empirical technology. Now, you can observe brainwave patterns, which are electromagnetic waves produced by the molecules and nerve fibers and everything else in the brain, but that's not observing a mental state. That's observing some electromagnetic waves produced by some molecules and nerves. The mental state itself can only be experienced by the mind. It's kind of like there's an old analogy comparing the dreaming state to the waking state. It says you can't use a waking state gun to shoot a dreaming state tiger, because they operate on completely different levels of reality. When we go to sleep and we dream at night, we experience a mental world. We experience forms and phenomena, colors, people, things, but our physical organs of sight, sense, hearing, and all that are not operating. What's operating are our mental organs of sight, sense, hearing, and so on. We're not experiencing anything physical. We're experiencing a mental world, which in many ways resembles very closely the physical world that we experience when we're awake. The point is that all of our mental states are upheld by this field of mind stuff, chitta, life force, which the Hermetic sages described as mind. It's a beautiful passage from the Hermetic text, which says that mind is the very substance of God, if there is such a substance. And it goes on to say, and of the nature of that substance, no one really knows what its nature is for sure, because it's in between matter and consciousness. It's not a material substance. It's literally the substance of consciousness, which is capable of reflecting pure consciousness, which is not a substance at all, in the field of creation. That's why they called it mind stuff. In fact, in the Vedic tradition, the jiva, the individual self, the individual soul, was defined as the reflection of pure consciousness in mind stuff, in chitta. That was the definition of the soul, of the embodied soul, the mortal soul. And that substance, that subtle energy, subtle matter, subtle life force, mind stuff, is the key to understanding not only the relationship between consciousness and matter, but also the whole science of alchemy. By operating on that level of nature, and I'm talking about a level of nature. I'm not talking about something that's just in the individual human mind. This field of mind stuff pervades all space. It's all pervading in nature. It's the very stuff that gives matter, ordinary forms of matter, the property called mass or inertia. But that which gives can also take away. When the field of chitta operates in one way, it gives matter the appearance of having mass or inertia. When it operates in another way, it takes away that appearance so that consciousness itself can shine through. It has the potential to remove the veil that makes matter, quote, matter. And by removing that veil, matter becomes spiritualized, it becomes conscious, it becomes awake to its own reality as consciousness. But there's more to it than that. You know, every elementary particle in creation is associated with a spin. In fact, the particles are classified according to their spin states. But it goes beyond that. Every atom in creation consists of a nucleus around which electrons orbit. It's a spinning system. It's a rotating system. You go to a larger scale of reality, the solar system. Every star or sun in creation has planets that are rotating around it. In fact, you know, as of today, you know, astronomers have determined that have located about 300 different planets on other solar systems, have identified about 300 different planets on other solar systems. I just read an article a couple of days ago where they're now predicting that there are possibly billions of Earth-like planets throughout our galaxy. Possibly billions of Earth-like planets throughout our galaxy, which would have the potential to support life. All of these solar systems are rotating systems. Go to a larger scale of reality. The galaxy, which consists of some 200 billion star systems, all of which are in some state of rotation around the center of the galaxy, like a planet rotating around the sun. Go to a larger scale of reality, the visible universe taken as a whole. There, the galaxies are rotating and moving around the hypothetical center of the universe, if there is such a thing. And according to the ancients, there is. What do these rotating systems on all levels, which are basically rotating forms of matter, have to do with subtle life force? Have to do with the creation of this mind stuff? What they have to do with it goes back to a Vedic myth. I think we discussed it in one of our previous talks, called the Samudra Manthan, or the churning of the ocean. And in my book, Transcendental Mechanics, which is basically my magnum opus, theoretical magnum opus, dealing with really a gauge field theory of consciousness, where consciousness is treated as the essence of the unified field. Very sophisticated, in-depth mathematical treatment of the subject, which is not really suitable for a lay audience. But the point is that this field of mind stuff is modeled as a superfluid field, like superfluid helium. Now, it's known if you stir a bucket, say, of superfluid helium, what happens is that the superfluid breaks down into quantized vortices, like little tiny bathtub whirlpools. And in 3 dimensions, this becomes a spherical vortex, kind of like a particle, kind of like a solar system, kind of like a galaxy. And these quantized vortices in the superfluid field of mind stuff becomes the mind stuff out of which our minds are fashioned. They're subtle particles with infinitesimal spin, which reflect consciousness. And that is the link between the field of pure consciousness, which can be compared to a superfluid field of pure consciousness, and ordinary particles, ordinary forms of matter and force. In fact, in the philosophy called Sankhya, which means enumeration, which is a fundamental philosophy in the Vedic tradition, the particles of chitta, mind stuff, all other particles are said to be fashioned out of those particles. It is the primordial stuff out of which everything is created, out of which all forms of matter are created through combination and permutation. So when you break down matter, ultimately it turns out to be nothing but mind stuff. It's just a congelation, a crystallization of mind, which in turn is but a crystallization, a condensation of consciousness. And it's all produced by churning the ocean of consciousness. By churning the ocean of consciousness, stirring the ocean of consciousness, these quantized vortices, which are particles of mind stuff, automatically emerge as if out of nowhere. But they're not coming out of nowhere. They're coming out of the superfluid field of pure consciousness. When they emerge, they're created, so to speak. And that is produced by rotating on a microscopic technical level, stirring the ocean of consciousness is accomplished by rotating forms of matter in the vacuum of empty space, which is actually filled with consciousness. This means that every elementary particle, ordinary elementary particle, every atom, every solar system, every galaxy, the universe as a whole, is literally a generator of mind stuff, a generator of life force, a generator of that which links consciousness and matter. It's like the snake biting its own tail. That which is produced from the churning process acts back upon its own source to produce more churning, to produce more life force from which additional forms of matter can be created and grown. It's a self-referral feedback mechanism whereby the universe bootstraps itself as if out of nothing, but actually it's out of consciousness. Now, the important point here is that these guru atoms of the elixir are not just ordinary atoms. I make the case in my book Elixir of Immortality that actually they're super heavy elements. And what I mean by that is that they contain a nucleus that is on the order of atomic number 114 or 115. Since there are hundreds more nucleons in the nucleus than in an ordinary stable atom. Those nucleons, each one of them, acts as a stirring rod in the field of pure consciousness to produce particles of chitta, to produce particles of mind stuff which are capable of reflecting consciousness. They're super abundant generators of life force. And when those atoms are introduced into our bodies, they fill our bodies with light. Not the light that we see with our eyes, but the light of consciousness, the light of mind, the type of light that we see in our dreaming state. We're not seeing the light in our dreams with our eyes. Where does the light come from? It comes from mind. I mean, our dreams are filled with color. They're filled with colorful objects, colorful forms and phenomena. That color is not seen with the eyes. It's seen by the mind. It's produced by the mind. And the same is there when it's produced by mind stuff. And when our bodies become filled with the superabundant production of mind stuff that's generated by these guru atoms that are in the body, every atom, every cell, every molecule in the body becomes bathed in that field. Which that means that the body is capable of reflecting consciousness more fully. It's capable of reflecting the field of pure consciousness more fully. And when that field reaches a certain intensity, we become enlightened. What enlightenment means. Our minds and bodies become filled with light, the light of mind, the light of consciousness. And I mean that literally. So that when an enlightened person closes their eyes, they don't see blackness. They see an unbounded field of light. The light of consciousness, the light of the world. the light that's described in the opening passage of the book of John as the light of men, which is the life of God. But there's a technical, this whole thing is not just a bunch of metaphysical philosophy. There's a very profound, deep science associated with it. And the science is directly connected to the nucleus of the atom and the ability of the nucleus to produce life force when it's in a high spin state. Or even in an ordinary state, it produces life force, but it produces much more when it's in a high spin. The nucleus is in a high spin state, which is the nature of monatomic elements and also the nature of the elixir. When the atom is in a high spin state, it becomes a superabundant source of life force. It's a generator of life force, a creator of life force. And it's like putting little nuclear generators in the body, which don't produce nuclear radiation. We're not talking about destructive nuclear radiation. We're talking about the radiation of life force, the radiation of the light of consciousness. It's a very different thing. And that is the key to all the benefits that come from consuming or ingesting the elixir, is the field of life force that's produced in the body, which is capable of reflecting more consciousness, capable of reflecting more intelligence in the body. And that means that the field of life force is capable of repairing defects in the DNA, capable of organizing the body to purge itself of toxins, to heal itself, to repair itself, to regenerate itself. That's why those who consumed the elixir were said to have very, very long lifespans. You know, in ancient times, if you go back and look at the Vedic tradition talks about sages living for thousands of years in a physical body on Earth. Not just 120 years or 100 years, but thousands of years. I mean, even if you look at the biblical patriarchs described in the book of Genesis, which, according to the Jewish calendar, goes back to a period of around 6,000 years ago, starting around 4000 BC, which is not that long ago in the overall scheme of things. The biblical patriarchs is described as living for hundreds of years. You know, was Methuselah supposed to live for what, 980 something years? But all of them lived for several hundred years at least. I mean, even in the time of Abraham, which was 1900 BC approximately, his father Terah was said to have lived for 245 years. Now, why is that? Well, according to the medieval alchemists of Europe, who wrote elaborate commentaries on the book of Genesis, deciphering its profound alchemical secrets, the Hebrew tradition was actually a tradition of alchemical priests originally. I mean, even the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, supposedly of Adam, we don't really know whether he was born of Adam. What we know is that he was born of Eve. His name was Cain. And we don't know that he's really born of Adam because the book of Genesis is somewhat ambiguous about it. It says that Eve conceived Cain by the help of the Yahweh Elohim, whatever that means. Yahweh is of course the Jehovah, but Elohim is plural for gods. And Yahweh Elohim really means the, the, the God of the gods, the head of the gods. And so there's some belief, some people think that, Cain was conceived through an immaculate conception, like, Jesus was born of Mary through the Holy Spirit. And there's others who claim that these Yahweh Elohim were actually um, the lords of the garden, the enlightened sages who walked the earth in the prehistorical era when the earth resembled a Garden of Eden. And they were actually godlike men who walked the earth at that time, who were known as the lords of the garden. But at any rate, in Hebrew, the word for Cain is Cain, which literally means a metalsmith, an alchemist. Now, in ancient times, the son adopted the profession of the father. Professions were passed down along hereditary bloodlines. That's why the seventh descendant of Cain was known as Tubal-Cain, who was proclaimed as the master of all who work in the metals, copper, silver, gold. Tubal-Cain eventually became deified in the Roman tradition as the god Vulcan, or Vulcan, the Roman god of metallurgy and volcanism, working with the metals and the fire. Now, of course, there's this whole biblical story about Cain and his younger brother Abel, and how Cain was sent out to wander the face of the earth, and so on. There's much deeper. Um, this is actually a spiritual allegory. There's a much deeper interpretation of this than what is generally put on it by biblical scholars. It's an alchemical interpretation. But at any rate, the medieval alchemists believed that Adam and his whole lineage, and there was a split in the lineage of Cain and the lineage of Seth, but the whole lineage was alchemical. They were alchemical masters. And they wrote elaborate commentaries on the book of Genesis, including all the myths, including the myth of the flood, and so on, explaining how those myths related to the practice of alchemy. And what they really were alchemical allegories. Now, of course, this was written by Moses. The book of Genesis was written by Moses, supposedly, who had been educated in Egypt. And I think we discussed this in our last preliminary talk, how Moses delivered the manna to his people. The manna, I believe, was a monatomic form of copper, which indicates Moses was quite an adept in the alchemical secrets himself. And therefore, it makes sense that he would encode those secrets in the book of Genesis, creating a myth that presents a history, yet also encodes a secret science, a spiritual science, science about the relationship of consciousness and matter, and how that science can be used to bring about enlightened human beings. But there's a thing though in that the Earth itself is a generator of life force, because the Earth itself is a rotating system, rotates around its own axis. And that means that every atom and molecule in the Earth, for example, on the surface of the Earth, is rotating around the center of the equator. It's rotating around the center of the Earth at about 1,000 miles an hour. This follows from the fact that the circumference of the Earth at the equator is about 24,000 miles. And it takes 24 hours for a complete rotation. So, a person standing on the surface of the Earth at the equator is rotating around the center of the Earth at 1,000 miles an hour. Now, it looks like we're just standing still on the surface, but actually we're not. We're spinning around the surface of the Earth. That also acts to produce life force from the very center of the Earth, which percolates up and pervades the Earth, and literally represents the mind of the Earth, Mother Earth itself. Every form of matter in existence. The Hermetic sages had a beautiful understanding of this. They called the universe the cosmos and considered it to be a great god. And they said that there is nothing in the cosmos, nor has there ever been anything in the cosmos since the very beginning of time, that is not alive. There is no such thing as anything dead in the cosmos. Everything, every form of matter, including inorganic matter, is alive and endowed with mind. There's many ancient cultures that believe this. Even you go in Japan, for example, even today, it's traditional when the Japanese buy a new car, when they build a new machine, when they build a new factory, they do a little ceremony to the spirit of the car. They do a little ceremony to the spirit of the machine, to the spirit of the factory. Because there's the deep traditional understanding that inorganic machine made out of metal and gears and everything else actually has some kind of a mind associated with it. The field of mind stuff that is produced by every atom in that machine. Now, this field of mind stuff that's on the surface of the Earth and that's produced from the center of the Earth affects the consciousness of every individual being on or in the Earth. But that's one field. There's also the field of our solar system that's produced from the sun at the center of the solar system. The Earth is immersed in that field. And our solar system, the field of mind that's associated with the solar system, is immersed in the larger field of mind of the galaxy, which is in turn immersed in the larger field of mind of the universe, which in turn is immersed in the larger field of mind of what the Vedic seers call the Akshara Brahman, the imperishable, ever-expanding wholeness, which they claimed consisted of an infinite number of universes like our own. So there are many layers of fields of mind stuff that exist in the universe, and even beyond the universe. And these fields are subject to waves, wave phenomena, like a fluid, like waves in a fluid. They're subject to streams, like streams in a fluid. They're subject to vortices, like a whirlpool in a fluid. These are all different modes of behavior that are there in the field of mind stuff. The ancients understood that all these things are connected. Every form of matter in the universe is connected by various rotating streams of mind stuff, which they compared to threads out of which the web of creation is woven. They also compared them to, in the Vedic tradition, they were compared to hollow tubes, reeds, through which consciousness flows from one form of matter to another. Kind of like a hollow tornado. You know, rotating forms of fluid air around a hollow core. It's actually also filled with air, but of a lesser density. So, again, there's a science to all of this. And the thing is that the field of mind stuff is actually imbued with cosmic intelligence. It's literally a reflection of consciousness, a reflection of intelligence. But not individual intelligence. We're talking about cosmic intelligence. I mean, intelligence can be defined as that which enables us to conceive order, coherence, and symmetry in and amongst our ideas. Well, the ideas of the Supreme Being are the forms and phenomena of creation, which are governed, we know, by very profound laws which obey mathematical, precise principles and are literally a reflection of some vast intelligence that enables the whole thing to work like a perfect piece of clockwork precision. And the ancients believed that the earth itself is subject to cycles. And I talk about this in, I think, my third chapter in Pillar of Celestial Fire, the cosmic clock, which literally represents a cycle of the earth undergoing a precessional cycle in its rotation, where the rotational axis of the earth changes its orientation relative to the ecliptic of the sun over a period of about 26,000 years. But the ancients tied that rotational cycle to the rise and fall of mind stuff or subtle energy on our planet, which corresponds to the rise and fall of consciousness on our planet. Now, there are subcycles within the larger cycle. The cycle was mapped out in terms of 24 zodiacal ages, each of which lasts for about 2160 years. You know, such as the age of Aquarius, which we're about to go into, or on the cusp of, or maybe already in it, depending upon what kind of astronomical theory you buy into. And the ancients believed that these astrological ages, these 24 astrological ages, can be compared to the 24 hours in a day and night cycle on Earth. Except that this cosmic clock, instead of having 24 hours of 60 minutes, you have 24 hours of 30 degrees. And or 24 hours, each hour lasting for 2160 years. And according to my calculations and interpretations of this, and I've done a historical rectification of this in some detail in my book that'll be coming out here shortly, called The Final Event, Dawn of the Age of Truth, where I've shown that this cycle that was predicted thousands of years ago
accurately reflects the rise and fall of human civilizations on Earth that we know of from recorded history. And the prediction is that where we are right now in time corresponds to 6 o'clock in the morning on the cosmic clock. We're looking at the dawn of a new day that's going to last for the next 13,000 years before we approach the next dusk or sunset. This is a very, very profound time in human history. And the prediction was from the ancients that, and which can be derived from the symbology of the astrological signs. The fact that we're moving into the age of Aquarius is very significant because Aquarius is the water bearer of the gods in the Greek tradition, who carried the pot of ambrosia. No ordinary water. The ambrosia was the drink by which the gods attained immortality. Literally, the elixir of immortality, and the pot that he carried was the alchemical vessel. Exactly the same symbology in the Vedic tradition, where the sign of Aquarius is called Kumbha, the pot. And in the Vedic tradition, Aquarius is said to, in Jyotish, which is Vedic astrology, the name of Aquarius is Kumbha, the pot, and it's the pot which was the final product of the churning process, churning the ocean of consciousness. The final culmination was the production of the elixir of immortality, which was delivered in a pot, a kumbha, and which was delivered. It contained the rasa, which the scriptures say both mortals and immortals sought to obtain. So without mincing words, we can say that the age of Aquarius is the age when the science of alchemy, which has been coming on for thousands of years, has gone underground stream, and has largely been lost. The science of alchemy will be not only rediscovered, but that the product of alchemy, the elixir of immortality, will be made available to every man, woman, and child on earth, bringing about a transformation of human civilization society unprecedented in recorded history.
Robert, I think this is the perfect place to stop this lesson. You've wrapped it all up magnificently. We have so much to think about in preparation for the next class. I want to thank you for offering so much wisdom and knowledge and enlightenment in this class, Robert.
Well, thank you, Deborah. It was, as always, a pleasure. Look forward to our next meeting.
Likewise.